It sounds like the last hymn is playing downstairs, so I expect that we'll have a few more people joining us shortly. But we are fortunate to have this morning Ashanti Hamilton to be our forum speaker. Ashanti has been a former council president and common council member, and was appointed by Mayor Johnson to the Office of Violence Prevention last fall. I think you said it's about September since you
mid-September.
We're serving, so he's pretty new on the job, but I'm glad he's able to join us here. And we really appreciate your stepping up at the last minute. Mayor Johnson was actually our scheduled speaker for today, but he's been called to Washington for a program on lead and lead poisoning in our youth, which is an important issue all by itself. So we will work to get Mayor Johnson here sometime in the near future. But we will hear this morning about violence prevention from Ashanti's point of view, and he's asked me to call him Ashanti rather than Mr. Hamilton. Otherwise, I would be formal. But in talking to him on Thursday, he talked about liking the engagement in the position, and said there's huge expectations, which is one of the things that has to be managed and talked about, and I'm sure you all will have some questions. But it's serious work, he says, and important work. So let's welcome to our forum here, Ashanti Hamilton. I can get you a refill of coffee if you need it.
No, it's good.
You're good. Okay.
As long as you don't mind if I turn around and pick it up every now and again. Well, thank you, Bruce, for that introduction. As Bruce said, I am Ashanti Hamilton, and I'm fairly new at the position of the Director of Office of Violence Prevention. And I really appreciate this opportunity to come before you. And I want to thank the mayor for at least thinking of our office as something that you may be interested in speaking about. I've been very impressed with the mayor and his handling of the magnitude of the job of mayor of a city that's in such transition. And so I'm thankful for his leadership and the push that he has for supporting this kind of work in the city. But I wanted to jump right into this because this is oftentimes very misunderstood work. And a lot of times there is a hyper focus on the work that we have in the Office of Violence Prevention around very traumatic incidents that are occurring in our community, primarily focused around gun violence. And it's been an important part of the communication of this office that we began to recognize the importance of going further upstream and dealing with violence prevention work, and why it's important to try to create an environment where these types of incidents don't occur in the first place. And so what we've done is begin to build partnerships in the community so that there is a recognition of a role that everybody can play in creating more stable, safe communities. But I think it's important at this stage to try to give you an understanding of some of the work that we have been known for. And in part, it's important to do that because the work that we've been doing the last couple years as an office, and I participated in this as a council member and instituted some of these as a council president. When they were new, no department necessarily wanted to do this work, and we had to start it somewhere. So we started it in my district as an office. And that's violence interruption work. So that's the idea of identifying credible messengers in a community that may have lived experience in the criminal activity space, made the conscious decision to choose a better lifestyle and agree to get training on how to engage the community, engage law enforcement in order to be able to head off violence once it has occurred, right? To stop retaliatory violence in the community. And, you know, it's been widely known as violence interruption work, credible messengers, and community navigators, right? So that work that we started on the council, you know, right out of the president's office when I was president, inspired our local version of violence interrupters, and that's called 414 Life. And you know, we had some great directors that were in this office before I came that helped to fine tune how we were implementing that strategy here in the city. And it's the idea of being able to build the type of relationships with the many communities. You know, I still call them community members, whether we want to classify them as gangs or you know, other law enforcement terms that kind of use to describe groups of people who get together to do common things, right? And you know, I always found you know, the use of the term gang in our lexicon to kind of it evokes this negative thing, you know. That's the case. I belong to a couple gangs myself, where we share same colors, we kind of have a same lived experience, and you know, we have special handshakes, and you know, and we go to the same things, and you know, and we do things together. So I call it a fraternity, a Phi Beta Sigma Fraternity Incorporated. We have calls and everything, right? Outside of the fact that we don't engage in criminal activity, and the purpose of us coming together is to actually give back to the community, in all definitions, it would still be called a gang, right? And I think in many cases, what we're seeing with young people and these situations where whether we call them gangs or whether we call them cliques or whether we call them just youth groups that get together, is that they have a common lived experience that's pulling them together. And that common lived experience is oftentimes built around a shared trauma. A shared what? Trauma. Right. So a shared crisis, a shared traumatic experience, a shared community struggle, right? Either it's, you know, we grew up in the same neighborhood and there was the neighborhood was in an area that had concentrated poverty, and then all of the experience that come along with that. There are a lot of them that have what we called a crisis connection, which is they have a friend that died a traumatic death. And so they get together in remembrance of that friend. And then they call their group of friends the name of that friend that passed away. You know, one of the popular groups that, you know, that is operating in the city now, like that is, you know, you probably heard it in the news, the Renzo Boys. But there are, you know, at least a half a dozen other groups like that, where they take on the name of, you know, a loved one, a friend of theirs that that passed away traumatic. And so, this trauma-based connection that they have, then, they have a sense of responsibility for each other. They have to prove that they can stand up for each other. They have to prove that they can protect each other. And then we start to see the type of activity when adolescents are making those types of decisions without proper guidance, without proper instructions, without proper community structures around that. It can be a very deadly combination. And so what we've experienced in the city, because we've talked about the record number of homicides that we've been experiencing in the city of Milwaukee over the course of the past 3 years. I like to remind people that we are often, that number that we're talking about now that's reached over 200 was actually being compared to the 1991 number, right? That was the influx of crack cocaine into the community. And then the turf wars that grew out of, the sale and the protection of territory and, the complication of the underground drug market, and kind of like this explosion of homicides that occurred in 91. That's been kind of that was the top. Everything was compared to how close are you getting to this 91 number. Very different circumstances happening across the country around why this violence is occurring now, as opposed to why it was occurring like this back then, right? So we have this but now this is exploding far beyond those 91 numbers. So what's happening, right? So there are two areas that we're noticing that's causing this explosion. One is this youth violence amongst these youth groups, and the other is domestic violence. And it was pretty clear, national trends across the country, that the pandemic and some of the stressors around what was happening during the pandemic and the uncertainty around it exacerbated a lot of the disparities that already existed in our community. And the result of that has been a spike in homicides. So interpersonal violence, interpersonal relationships, and the stresses that caused in interpersonal relationships also cause a spike in homicides. So with those two, it almost completely blew the lid off what was expected as to, what people would anticipate in the area of violence prevention in the area of homicides. And so a lot of the work that we're trying to design now, since I've come into the office, is, and a lot of this is being driven by ARPA funding. There's been many conversations around where to place the resources around ARPA funding, and the primary focus for a lot of ARPA funding, whether it's in the area of violence prevention or it's in any other department, right? So whether we're talking about housing, employment, health disparities, a lot of the resources that ARPA funding is directed toward is trying to mitigate and change the course of those disparities. So in many ways, the whole work of the whole impact of ARPA funding is supposed to lead us to reduce the symptoms of object poverty, concentrated poverty. And as you know, 3-4 years ago, both the county and the city declared racism a public health issue, and racism being a root cause as to why these disparities exist in such a regular way from coast to coast in our country. All right, it's such a common experience and a common recognition as to why we can't get over some of the issues that create these disparities in our community. So that leads me to the second area of the second thing that I think we need to pay attention to as an office, which is institutional and systemic racism as a root cause of violence in our community. And one of the things that you hear on a regular basis when engaging both victims of violence and perpetrators of violence in our community is the distrust that they have of institutions, of government, of law enforcement, of the court system, the economic system. So there's this almost universal experience, whether you are a victim of violence or whether you are perpetrating violence in some way, shape, form, or fashion, that there's an unwillingness to engage the institutions that have been built and stood up to actually give you assistance to help navigate many of those issues that you're dealing with. There's an unwillingness to even engage those institutions because they don't provide assistance and support. For example, we've had a number of parents who were willing to engage the system around problems, child rearing, and being able to control the adolescent or a young child, and engaging the system about the problems that they were having with their children ended up being the subject of persecution because of problems that they may have had, things that they revealed, and then had problems being able to maintain parental control over that child, and then being brought to the court system, child protective services being activated, and then creating a whole litany of legal issues around engaging the system when you are only engaging to try to get assistance. And it's a common theme, a common problem, and we want to be able to assist in being able to mitigate that engagement so that it doesn't turn negative, especially when there's a voluntary engagement with the system. We seem to do very well, and I use very well loosely, meaning getting people to engage when people are mandated to do it, right? Like after the criminal justice system is activated, somebody is sent to court, a judge enters a ruling that says you are now ordered to take anger management classes, you are now ordered to take parenting classes, and you are now, ordered to have child visitation, sharing rules, and this is when you guys are going to visit your children, and this is how that thing is going to go, right? Everybody comes together, right? And all the therapists are there, all of the facilities in order for these things to happen are there. The ability to enforce it is there. If you don't meet this meeting at this time, you have to go back to court and do this thing. Officers are going to come to the house and make sure that the kids are being brought to this location at this time. There's all of this coordination after you've been judged to, not have been compliant, or the judge has found you to engage in some criminal activity. In the vast majority of the people that we're dealing with, the vast majority of people that are living in our communities, simply trying to build a better life for themselves and their children, are not criminals, right? They're not criminals. And the way our system operates creates criminals. And so it's important for us as an office and as a a voice being community facing, that there's an advocacy arm around not increasing and changing policy of institutions and systems change so that we're not creating problems and issues in our community for families, especially for institutions that were created to serve this population. And in some cases, you would hear many advocates who support this work would say that that is the primary purpose. Because more than anything else, that this creates this is one of the things that create the environment. When we were talking earlier, our job is to change the environment where violence is occurring. That this single thing may be the most impactful change that we can make collectively as a community to change the violence that's happening in communities across the country, but definitely here in the city of Milwaukee.
Could you say that again? What is this one thing that is so important?
This one thing that is so important is the existence of institutional racism and systemic racism that is creating disparities in our community, that is producing the environment that invites violence. So, not an easy task considering the political environment that we are existing in right now. There is no question that all of us have probably in the last couple of days witnessed the videotape from Memphis, Tennessee, where it was pretty universally recognized that we had law enforcement and a resident engaged in a traffic stop where that resident was treated with the most horrific brutality. And it was done by representatives of law enforcement in an institution that that people in the Black community have been saying this is the type of thing that's been happening in our community for decades, and found it very difficult to get people not only to recognize it, but this constant, you're in this constant feedback loop of trying to convince people that this is actually happening and that this is real and that this is a common experience for a whole entire community. And, you know, it was the first time that we kind of had this universal response to a thing so horrific. It seems to be, well, I guess it's happened a number of times in our lifetime. You know, and some of us, you know, considering that I'm earning my own gray hair, you know, because I will talk to my children about, you know, Rodney King and the LA riots, and it's something that they never experienced. They didn't know about it. It seems like ancient history to them. You know, and so, you know, and so I know that we have examples like Emmett Till, and, you know, as we kind of move through history, there have been these moments. But it seemed like the George Floyd kind of public display of his murder ignited not only the protest community, but it also awaken the consciousness of our country across the board about the need for reform and the need for building a different type of relationship that we have, not only with law enforcement, right? Not only with law enforcement, but with all of our institutions that devalue life and our engagement with very vulnerable communities. And so it was a recognition, and there is a certain level of frustration I think we've reached with a tolerance for this type of blatant disregard for human life. And hopefully we can turn that intolerance for this type of behavior into some systems change. And we have to be able to engage people who are actually operating these systems with the type of suggestions and the type of examples where things have worked so that they can actually make the change, get the proper training, and do things different. But a lot of that change begins with us, right? And it begins with a certain level of empathy, begins with a certain level of accountability and expectation that we have for people who are actually running our institutions. You know, I've had some conversations with those in the activist community, and you know, there is a certain belief that the more progress that we make kind of collectively, and we awaken a collective conscious of members of our community, and we actually make progress in building that intolerance, that those who believe differently, who don't value life in the same way most of us do, become more agitated in their willingness to be even more extreme in their opposition and their fight against change. That this is kind of pushing us to some kind of public confrontation around whether or not we're going to protect human dignity and human life, and you know, quite honestly, the foundation of human democracy, I mean of American democracy, and in this country. I think it's important for us to push that because it's the compromises in this space, right? Like in this space that we're in now, we're supposed to have boundaries, right? Where there are protections against certain things, period. There's something that we all agree that's right. That is the way it's supposed to go. And Dr. Martin Luther King used to talk about this when he talked about this, the acceptance of gradualism, right? Like when we kind of accept the fact that, and I've said this in other public forums, and it kind of struck a nerve with some people. When you're in a position where you are engaging young people, I have daughters, and I was able to go to college. I was able to graduate. I was able to go to law school. I was able to get a good education, and I was able to use that education in order to serve my community. But I have many friends that didn't have that opportunity. And now I have daughters, and I'm fighting for them to be able to have that opportunity, even the opportunity to make mistakes and then be able to recover from those mistakes. Like most people should, I think most of you have been able to make mistakes, rebound from mistakes, continue living, and be productive in your life. How unfair is it for us to say to little children, we go to schools right now and we tell them the wonderful things that this country is supposed to represent. But we say, it's not going to be afforded to you. You're going to have to wait a generation or two, and maybe your children or your children's children will be able to enjoy that. But you keep fighting, and you keep the faith. And maybe in a couple generations, it'll be fair to you. Now, no one is talking about universal fairness and like everything is going to be some kind of utopia for everybody. Struggle is real in human existence. But there are certain things that we believe in, and most people would not feel like that's a fair thing to say to any group of young people in any school right now. None of you would say it, right? None of us would go and say, it's not for you though. And I think we need to have that type of protection for all of our children, for all of our communities, that there is a basic level of human dignity, a basic level of human safety that is protected and that is advocated for across the board. There's always been entities that have been willing to violate that community trust, to violate that shared vision of the human experience in this country. And there's always been a coalition of the willing that's been willing to push back against that. And so with that, I think I veered off Bruce into a soapbox as opposed to the office, but I would leave the time for questions.
Good, we've got some questions. I'll call on folks here. I neglected one little bit of business before starting, and that is to welcome Daniel Bauman here to the forum today. Daniel grew up in this church and is son of Kathy Cruz and Tom Cruz, who have been members here, who I now understand are going to UUCW, Church West, right? Most of the time. But Daniel's in the mayor's office and has been a very key person in lining up the mayor first and then Ashanti. So welcome. I have some questions, but let's take some from the audience first, and let's go take a swing through here and start over there.
Yeah, if you could repeat the question so the people at home can know what it was.
Okay.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So I'm about to retire. It seems like the system being tasked to do something. I've been involved with this whole issue, organized forum on psychology of racism, and the NAACP met here, tried to get a anti-bullying program that was effective at the Milwaukee Public Schools. My wife is recently sold a clinic. They tried to do a lot of consciousness raising about the issue of systemic racism, and it seems like the amount of effort you put in, it's so little return. And I want to engage this more in my retirement, but it's hard to maintain the motivation because there's so little happening. And I was so happy when Barack Obama was elected, and then the backlash what we get after Trump. So it's hard to maintain the motivation to do something to fight injustice. I don't know whether
You have a question, or is that a?
well,
comment?
how do we as suburban white folk
Yeah.
maintain that motivation? And even looking at the church,
We got some suburban, and we've got some city folks here too.
Yeah, but I mean, our church is really white too, and we just, you know, it's just,
Yeah,
it's hard to keep the faith on. Working.
yeah. So let me engage that a minute, because I think you raise a very important question. I mean, your comment points to something that I think we collectively are bad at, and those that think differently than we do are good at, which is allowing our differences to not keep us fighting together for common causes that we care about. They'll have their common causes. They don't even necessarily have to be in the same room, but when they hear the whistle, they all come running and they all do their thing, right? And I think we allow urban, suburban, racial, I listen to this, we listen to that, we eat here, we eat there, kind of keep us from kind of sharing a table. And what we have to become better at, and I mean both of us, is creating the platforms where we can continually come together fighting for issues that we care about, regardless of whom or what. And that's exactly one of the things that is at least on our agenda, since we get some more staff. We'll talk with the mayor's office now about maintaining that, being able to maintain spaces where we're actually continuing to reach out to partners that are fighting for the same things. And in actuality, you probably get an invitation to some of those as a church, not necessarily from the suburban point of view, but definitely from a faith-based point of view of being able to come to the table to partner on moving these efforts forward. And then for you being able to say, hey, this is what we can do in order to keep things moving forward. And so we have our first meeting with some community organizers on January 31st. We're going to have the exact 5:30 and 5 o'clock in the evening. A lot of community-based organizations, community organizers are invited to that one. We're going to have one specifically for faith-based, and then you can see kind of what the city strategy is for dealing with this on a large scale. And it's directly addressing your ability to be able to come to the table and be able to contribute in some way and hopefully feel like we're making progress.
Yeah. The church is involved with Micah and Common Ground as two organizations working on some of these issues. We've got active groups that you can join if you care about some of those issues. We've got a Black Lives Matter group that you can join that also can work on some of these. And perhaps in your retirement, you can get Ashanti's phone number, and maybe there's a way of, I don't know, running seminars or continuing and collaborating in some way. Rod.
What I take away from your presentation is we need to get ahead of the curve. And for example, in Memphis, now they've disbanded this force. They should have done that before.
Right.
So how does the city get ahead of the curve? And then one way, Section 8 housing, for example, Common Ground, that Bruce just mentioned, is meeting this coming week, to start a campaign, because we understand that people who live in Section 8 housing are treated terrible. I mean, they're evicted right and left. And so we've got to get ahead of the curve. So we're looking for a way that we can get the people who manage Section 8 housing not to be, you know, to understand these people who live there and not say, get out of here. So there's stuff going on.
Yeah.
Just read what, you know, sign up for MICA and Common Ground information and you get plenty of it.
Yeah, Michael's been a strong partner already. And I've actually met with Common Ground and Micah separately in their own separate meetings. Because they have been extremely effective in many of their advocacy roles. So you talk about magnifying our collective impact. Those are two huge examples of how that works. I have to do an own personal plug. I was a recipient of the Do What Is Just award from Micah. So
Thanks. Sharon had a question.
One of you is enough.
Okay, can you say a little bit more about how the office works? We've heard about interrupters and some of those kinds of things. And also, one of the reasons we understand you were appointed is because of the accountability questions. How do you measure success? Many of us are involved with nonprofits who know how difficult that is to measure success. And so what would you say to the Common Council and the mayor and citizens who are interested in the accountability measures and how you determine success in the office?
Yeah. So first, there is a wide variety of work that we're actually engaged in, right? So a lot of the focus has been on the violence interruption work, as I mentioned earlier in the comments. So we partner with a lot of community-based organizations that are doing this work. One of them is the medical college. So the medical college houses our violence interruption programs. They've been very instrumental in our ability to be able to collect data about the activity that's happening with this violence interruption work. And we've kind of expanded that engagement to include activity by credible messengers that we've funded in partnership with the county. So even the credible messenger work that's not as extensive as, you know, being on the ground, engaging youth groups and being able to make contacts with victims' families and actually mitigate some of these retaliation situations. It's been difficult to get people to understand that there were 5 shootings last week, but there would have been 10 if these engagements didn't happen. I mean, I've witnessed I've witnessed someone who was so upset about the death of a loved one, was organizing and getting ready to go retaliate, and having interrupters there, talking to them, sitting them down, bringing other people in, engaging them, keeping them there to the point where they didn't go. Didn't leave the moment. They were on their way. And because of the engagement, decided not to, gave it some thought about it another day, thought about different ways, convinced them that justice was coming, it was possible, you don't have to do it yourself, and didn't go. Hard to measure something that didn't happen, right?
Yeah.
But I witnessed it. Saw the gun and everything, guns. So I'm hoping to be able to tell a better story with better data that we're able to collect. Once again, no miracles here. right? It's going to be very difficult to draw a causation line. But we can increase our activity and increase our coordination so that there could be a correlation, right? This increased activity, this increased engagement in the same areas that we're working in, you're seeing a reduction in crime. And I think that there is a way of telling that story and maybe even including some of this anecdotal information that help people to comprehend and understand the type of work. So that's on the difficult side. I think the more human side of this, when we talk about going upstream, and we're talking about building more resilient communities, some of the other work that we're doing is helping people go through these traumatic experiences, right? Given the type of support that's necessary to get through it, with support, with community support, with understanding what the resources are that's out there. Because in many cases, you know, once a family experiences a tragic death, whether it's through a car accident or whether it's through, you know, an unexpected homicide, and it's a youth, and that young person had a brother or sister that either witnessed it or was in the car when it happened, or the other young people that are in the vehicle when it happened, or in a house that was shot up multiple times, and there are young people in the house, and sometimes it's desensitizing to them. So this level of violence becomes normal, or they're the victims of abuse or some type of abuse, but having a plug-in to clinicians who can give them support, help them through it, so that their pain doesn't turn into pain that they then transfer to other people, right? We have a saying in this space that hurt people. And so many of the people that we see that are involved in some of the worst criminal activity or violent activity that we see have been victims themselves or repeated witnesses of that type of victim without any type of support and kind of working through those issues. So that's a space. And then this other space, which is, you know, we're working to build a more, you know, it's reducing violence through connectedness, right? We talk about our communities as if they are, you know, just extreme poverty everywhere, no resources, nothing positive in these communities. When the truth is, when you do an asset mapping of the things that actually exist in those communities, we're an asset-rich community. There's actually many things there to support families, many things to, but we had people when we were doing small focus groups who lived a block, 2 blocks away from the Employ Milwaukee site on 27th and North Avenue, who wanted to have employment information. They wanted to know about training. They wanted to know about jobs that they could get. And there are programs sitting right there in Employ Milwaukee, dedicated to their exact situation, very successful, putting people to work, and they had never entered the doors, never even, and they're walking distance away from it. We have to make those connections and build stronger communities.
The 11 o'clock service will be starting soon. If any of you need to go to that, can you stay a little longer past 11? If
Okay.
people want to have some more dialogue or questions, we'll take a few more, and then we can have some more informal discussion. Terry had a question.
The issue of lead in lead poisoning is one that has gotten attention, and one of the things that lead can also cause is behavior problems. And there have been some studies that has indicated that, violence is, at least, it may not be caused, but it is at least correlated with, lead poisoning. Do you have any comment on that?
Read a study out of UWM that made that exact argument.
Could you repeat the question?
I'm sorry.
Please.
So the question was, do I believe, or do what we see that is there a correlation between exposure to lead and compulsive behavior? And that there have been studies that kind of show that there is a correlation. And I was just validating that, yes, I have seen studies that that show that there is a correlation. There has been, in the medical community, that is the impact of lead around impulsive behavior. That impulsive behavior doesn't necessarily have to be criminal behavior, but we do know that in an environment where that's happening, some of that impulsive behavior may lead to that. What we are also seeing, is if you do a map to where there has been an over exposure to lead in the community, elevated blood levels in young children, that in those same areas, we are seeing, and when you put it on a heat map, those are also the same areas where you see increased criminal activity. So there's like literal mapping that shows that correlation. And so I think part of the communication that we're doing within the health department is now having a targeted, direct outreach in those particular areas, and helping those families actually, not only is it important for people who have experienced violence to get the proper assistance, but so that parents who have children who have had elevated blood levels also get the assistance to help with the symptoms of, having been exposed to lead at that level. So that's, that is a plan that wasn't part of the plan before, but we're working on getting that exposure. And once again, one of the biggest barriers to getting those families to actually have their children both tested and participating in the treatment plan is trust of the medical system and actually getting them to participate.
I think that's where Cole, the Coalition on Emergency, is having
They have been, so we talked about credible messengers and how we've used that for like violence interruption. Cole is in a very real way credible messengers in helping to get people to actually engage the healthcare system. So you're absolutely right.
Yeah, our Earth Justice Ministry is partnering with Cole, the Cole on lead emergency, and Terry's our liaison with that group. If any of you wanted to talk more about that. Maybe it hasn't been clear, but the Office of Violence Prevention is in the health department. It's located there, and so I think it's very clear the city is taking a public health approach to violence prevention, which is an interesting thing all by itself. I have one more question, but let me ask if there's any more out there first.
Well, I have one.
Ron.
So, you mentioned trust in people who run the institutions, and now you're not on the outside looking in, you're in the inside looking out. So what are your, and I may have missed this earlier, but what are your top 3 priorities with the Office of Violence Prevention?
So top 3, I would say engaging youth and and curbing youth activity that leads to violence and supports around that. Being able to have a better response to domestic violence, interpersonal violence, and our ability to offer the type of services that make people feel comfortable engaging in. And then the third one would be advocacy around racism, institutional racism, and systemic racism in our systems.
I'll ask my question then. You haven't mentioned the availability and prevalence of guns as an issue. I hear arguments, and I'm sure you can hear them in your head, and we can also all hear them in our heads on both sides of that issue. But do you think reducing the easy availability of guns would help in Milwaukee? And if so, how might that be approached?
So the short answer is absolutely. The availability of guns has been, we talked about impulsive behaviors, Terry left, but we talked about impulsive behaviors. It's very clear that many of our interpersonal violence situations occur, it's impulsive. The vast majority of these are people that you know, they're family members or friends, and you know these people. And they stem directly from arguments. Or, you know, drugs may play a role, but still, it's somebody that you know and felt comfortable enough to be in the room using drugs with, right? So the impulsive nature that accompanies some of these situations, you add a firearm to that equation, and it becomes deadly. What used to be a fist fight, a bar fight, a push and shove is now a deadly situation. The availability of guns to young people and the caliber of firearms that they have is unbelievable. The capacity that many of these weapons have allow them to have mass destruction in many situations, and their communication with these weapons, like shooting up cars, shooting up houses, the magnitude of the destruction that they're able to have because of the capacity of the weapons have created very deadly situations in our community. So, and around that, the reason why I didn't mention it a whole lot, because law enforcement mentions it a lot, is because we have been so unsuccessful fighting the gun lobby and being able to have some level of gun control. And we still have to be able to have some level of violence reduction, even with the presence of guns. But if we were able to have some control and have some sensible gun control, especially considering the high capacity situation that we're dealing with many of these weapons. It's the destruction that they can cause. Like, there's sensible things that we can do. You know, there's no way that level of access should be supported and not regulated.
What are some of the sensible things you think we can do?
Well, reducing the capacity of firearms, you know, reducing access to ammo. These high capacity weapons shouldn't be legal. There should be closing the gun show loophole where, you know, you get to sell your weapon without any regulation, nothing, if you're not a gun store. And there are a lot of weapons that are being transferred outside of gun stores. So you know, there are sensible things that we can do that can limit the access that people have. to just basic weapons.
Good. Let me mention in that regard that we've got a Supreme Court election coming up with a primary in February and the final election in April, I believe, and the state Supreme Court might have a big role in some of these issues. We were talking about that before Ashanti's talk, so please pay attention to the Supreme Court elections coming up. Question, Carol?
And my question is about anger, residual anger. The example that you gave of the interrupter person engaging with the young man, talking him down. And then the other example that you gave up is especially children who are observing death in their homes, bullets coming through the glass, all that trauma that children are experiencing. How available and good is or acceptable to the community is the mental health system? Like, is there a therapy program, within the community that can help this? Do they get the therapy? Is there not therapy available because there's not enough people who know how to handle that kind of thing? I'm just wondering, because to me, that is also one of the points where you can stop and stop escalation into the future. I'm a big believer of that, but is it available and is it accepted?
Yeah, so I would say short answers, yes, it's available in various forms, both by therapists and outside of the traditional setup, like a lot going through the county. There are clinicians that are out there that are available for this type of work. That's one of the programs we have is specifically designed for that in particular, for young people. So availability, yes. Are people accessing it and taking advantage of it? That would be a no. And a lot of people turn it down, even when it's presented to them and and it's available for them. They don't participate in it.
And is
Why?
it mistrust of the system? Is it there not enough therapists they identify over yeah, and the why?
And the why. And I think the why is still being worked through, but we do know right at the onset that there is a lack of trust. And most people who have turned it down have already had a negative experience with the process already. So they're rejecting it before they even are engaged, enough to know that this may be different, or you could choose your therapy, you could choose somebody else.
Yeah, I give you a second chance.
Yeah. But it's part of trust.
We've gone over here a bit. Let's spend the rest of the time with whatever time Ashanti is able to give us with informal discussion. I see at least one more hand, so.
Yeah, could we end the live stream?
Yeah, let's end the live stream now.
Thank you so much, man.
Thank you.